Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. When we think of dramatic global change and transformative technology, generally our gaze turns to Silicon Valley. And indeed, those changes have been dramatic and profound. But arguably bigger and more global changes have been taking place in the energy sector. Changes that shape our lives, shape the United States, and literally change the map of the world. While we pursue alternative energy such as wind and solar and battery technology, all important for the future, the technology of fracking and oil and gas extraction from shale has literally transformed the world. It's a world far different than existed when my guest Daniel Yergin wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Prize, back in 1991. Today, geopolitics, climate change, and the ever-growing thirst for energy to power the 21st century is shaping the world anew, and we're not paying enough attention. We're going to talk about this today with Daniel Yergin. He's one of the world's authorities on energy, international politics, and economics. He's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning bestseller, The Prize, and is the author of many other books, including The Quest, Shattered Peace, and Commanding Heights. He's the vice chairman of one of the leading information and research firms in the world, and a senior trustee of the Brookings Institution. It is my pleasure to welcome Daniel Yergin to the Who, What, Why podcast to talk about the new map, energy, climate, and the clash of nations. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
I want to talk first about what's changed, some of the fundamental changes in the past 30 years since you wrote The Prize, and at a time when we looked at the Middle East as kind of the gas station of the world.
Well, it is, it is very striking. That's why in the new map, it was an effort to say how much has this world changed, provide a framework, and do it in a lively narrative way that readers would enjoy reading. And three or four things really stand out. Number one, at that point, the question was only going to be how much more oil was the U.S. going to import? And that meant, as you just suggested, that what happened in the Middle East was so crucial to our future. So that was one thing. I think a second thing was that climate was just not on the agenda. I was thinking, this is not the first time Joe Biden's run for the presidency, and the first time he ran back then, climate was not a topic at all. Now, of course, it's central. And I think the third thing that was already the Soviet Union was breaking up, but the third big thing is China. I looked in The Prize, and China hardly occurred because it was just a self-sufficient country, and it wasn't part of the world system at all. It exported a little oil to Japan, and that was it. And today, China is the largest importer of oil in the world. It imports 75% of its oil, and the relationship between the U.S. and China is now the most important geopolitical issue in the world, and very much tied up with energy. So I think those are some of the mega changes that have occurred since the time of The Prize.
And of course, the other mega change that's happened is shale technology and the ability to get oil and gas out of shale.
Yes, that was all the textbooks said it was impossible, it couldn't happen. And then, you mentioned Silicon Valley and disruptive technology is associated with Silicon Valley. This was a disruptive technology, and it also required, as some of the innovations in Silicon Valley have required, somebody who was really stubborn and wouldn't give up. And that was a man named George Mitchell, who's the son of a Greek immigrant who ran a sort of a laundry in Galveston, Texas, and his son did well, went to university, and he just became convinced that there had to be a way to get oil and gas out of this very dense shale rock, because there's a lot of shale rock, and people said crazy, and they said, "You're wasting your money, George." He said, "Well, it's my money. I'll waste it if I want to." And it took 18 years, and then you had this breakthrough, and then people still didn't think it mattered very much, and then it turned out it mattered a lot. It transformed the world oil market and the world natural gas market, changed the position of the U.S. in the world, and meant that all this money that was going overseas to buy oil and import in this country instead was staying in this country and going into jobs. So it was a really big change.
Talk about the way that change took place roughly between 2000, when really fracking kind of changed the game, to 2018, where the U.S. finally overtook Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of oil and gas production.
Right. It began with gas, and in this, I would say 2003 was when you kind of had proof the technology could start to work on scale. And first it just showed up in natural gas, and then people said, well, this will never work with oil because the oil molecules are too big. They won't flow through the rocks. And so this one petroleum engineer at a company called EOG said, well, let's find out how big an oil molecule is, and let's look in the research. And there was no research about how big an oil molecule was. So they used like medical technology, scanning technology, and said, oh, it will work. And so about 2008, started to apply it to oil. And again, it was discounted. And the OPEC countries said, oh, this is just a blip. It will go away. And then about, 2012, we suddenly saw the real disruption in the world oil market with all this oil flowing in. And suddenly there was more oil than there was demand, and prices collapsed, and the U.S. continued to grow. And then and it was growing until COVID. And finally the U.S. became, as you pointed out, the number one producer, and that would have seemed inconceivable a decade ago. And that was a real shock to, Saudi Arabia. It was a real shock to Russia, the other two big producers.
And of course, it created a huge problem with respect to Russia and Saudi Arabia. Talk about that.
Well, it was really brought home to me very vividly when I was at a conference and Putin was on the stage with Chancellor Merkel of Germany. So they said to me, Dan, you asked the first question. So the question I was trying to ask him is, what are you going to do to Mr. Putin to diversify your economy and be less dependent on oil and gas? But I mentioned the word shale, and he started shouting at me, about how terrible shale was. And, it's really, you don't like being shouted at by Putin in front of 3,000 people. You feel a little nervous, particularly when it's inside Russia. But it's really two reasons he doesn't like it. One is because U.S. energy competes with Russian energy in Europe in terms of market. And two, he sees it as an adjunct to U.S. foreign policy, giving the U.S. flexibility. And I think nothing demonstrates that so clearly as our policies towards Iran under both President Obama and Trump, and what might be those policies under Biden. Because we were able, what the Obama administration did, said we were going to put sanctions and prevent Iranian oil from going to the market using our economic power. And the Iranians said, it won't work because you're going to need our oil. And it turned out we didn't, because U.S. oil replaced it. And, so that's, there would not have been a nuclear agreement under Obama with Iran were it not for the shale revolution, because you couldn't have used the sanctions.
Have we done everything that we could or should do in terms of projection of U.S. power and U.S. foreign policy, given the advantage we have with respect to oil, particularly since 2018?
I'm not sure what everything would be, but I think about it. I can see it in terms of India. I worked a lot in India. I was in a meeting with Prime Minister Modi when he came to the U.S. to talk about energy, when he spoke and so forth. And I can certainly see that our selling energy, oil and gas to India, has become, as Prime Minister Modi said last week, a major element, positive element in what has always been a very complex relationship with India. And India is a very important country for many reasons, including, the relationship that we have with them vis-a-vis China. So I think that's certainly an example of the positive impact in terms of relations with other countries. And I find, like when I talk to Koreans, South Koreans, other countries, they look on this change in the United States as really important because we provided them with options. And the Europeans look on it as really important because it gives them flexibility in terms of dealing with Russia, in terms of where their natural gas, which is where their natural gas comes from.
Talk a little bit about the impact that it's had on the relationship between Russia and China in particular.
Well, one of the big political changes is that Russia and China have really gotten close together. Last year I was in St. Petersburg, and Putin and President Xi were on the program together, and Putin said, I want to apologize to President Xi. I've kept you up till 4 o'clock your time talking. And Xi said, well, we never have enough time to talk. And of course, one of the things they talk about is their common animosity to the United States. And the other that they talk a lot about is energy. And that has really, at the same time that we were putting sanctions on a Russian pipeline to Germany, Putin, within weeks, had a huge ceremony with Xi where they pulled the valve and opened this flow of gas through what's called the Power of Siberia pipeline, which tells you a lot, to China. And that kind of connection is become a very important relationship because China needs energy, wants to diversify, and this is one of the ways that Russia can really deepen its relationship with China. So I say, maybe a little not facetiously, but but sort of tartly, that a relationship that was once based upon, between those two countries, that was based upon Marx and Lenin, is now based, or grounded at least, in oil and gas.
As China continues to move towards and find alternative energy, how is that going to impact that ongoing relationship with Russia?
Well, I think that relationship will grow in terms of alternative. China will continue to look for other sources, but it has actually stepped up its relationship with Russia. It's invested in this huge, expensive Arctic natural gas development that will take Russian natural gas to China. But China will continue to push for diversification. It will also, China kind of does everything. It has, half the world's solar, half the wind, half the electric cars. It's also building 3 new coal-fired plants a month. It needs energy for its economic growth, and that's a very high strategic priority for it. Also, the other thing that I was struck by, and I have it in the new map, Russia would not sell advanced weapon systems to China because they were afraid that China would copy them, and steal the IP. They've changed that policy now. They're selling their most advanced weapons to China, and they've said it's a priority because it's part of this larger relationship between the two countries. And I think maybe here we don't pay enough attention to how that relationship is going. There's a great photograph in the new map of Putin and Xi both wearing aprons, and Putin is showing Xi how to make Russian pancakes, which are called blinis. And, and the caption is, well, they're cooking this up. This is 2018. At the same time they were doing that, Chinese troops for the first time were participating in a massive Russian military exercise. And, it's sort of, we call it pancake diplomacy, but it's not just about pancakes.
As the energy transition continues globally towards renewable sources, does Russia become the loser in that equation, and what does it mean in terms of their next strategic moves?
That gets back to the diversification question. The other day, President Putin said it's great. He said, oil is no longer 45% of our budget, it's only 30%. That's because the oil prices have gone down. It's not because they're managing their economy differently. And I think that as an energy transition goes on, as Europe sort of uses less natural gas and moves in other directions, it becomes, I think that issue of diversification, the question that made him so mad at me, is still a very big question. But like all governments, I think the costs of the COVID crisis are going to kind of hamper what else you can do. But the same topics of reform have been on the table in Russia now ever since he came to power, and they always say they're going to do it, but it doesn't really happen. It still depends heavily on oil and gas.
Talk a little bit about the next steps as you see it for the U.S., given its dominance right now.
Well, I think the U.S. will continue to be this dominant player, at least for, let's say, the foreseeable future, and we're going to be the dominant player, one of the big 3 in terms of natural gas exports as well, because we have so much gas in this country. At the same time, I think that for the U.S., as this energy transition is going to go on, California utilities are using more wind and solar. The governor has called for the end of the sale of non-electric cars in 2035. So I think, we're basically in an era of a mixed energy supply system. And I also say in the book, we're in the post-Paris world, Paris being the 2015 climate agreement. U.S. left under Trump, but will re-enter. And I think in the post-Paris world, this continued push towards a lower carbon future is going to have a lot of strength behind it.
And finally, as we move to that future, Talk a little bit about China and how it ideally positions itself in that transition.
Well, that is something that really struck me when I was researching and writing the new map to understand China's position. In an energy transition away, towards new energies, as the Chinese call it, they benefit in two ways. One, less oil imports. They're worried about, they sell 50% more cars in China every year than they would do in the United States, and they worry about continuing to increase their imports and the risks that go with that. The other hand is that China has carved out a very interesting position in what they call the new energies. They produce about 70% of the world's solar panels. And another 10% from Chinese companies elsewhere. The Chinese manufacturing juggernaut has just made it very difficult for anybody to compete. They dominate the lithium-ion battery supply chain, and so they have a dominant position in rare earths. So I think we've seen a kind of wake-up call that's in the last several months. The European Union suddenly has done this report saying, hey, we have all these goals, but wait, how do we do it with, they don't use the word China, but being so dependent on China. So this is where energy and geopolitics really collide. It's not only in the traditional oil and gas, but it's also on wind, solar, and the technologies of moving towards a net zero carbon economy. There's a whole new range of geopolitical issues focused not on the Middle East, but focused on this increasingly complex, difficult, and incredibly important relationship between the United States and China.
We began by talking about how things have changed since the prize in 1991. If we look 30 years out from now, will the changes be as dramatic compared to what you're writing about in the new map?
Well, the hardest things to write in a book are the conclusion and then the introduction. What's it all about and what's going to happen? And on the conclusion, I sort of thought, gee, look at all the surprises that have come, good things, bad things since 2000. So, the plummeting of solar costs wasn't foreseen. The shale revolution wasn't foreseen. On the other hand, the financial crisis of 2008 wasn't foreseen. And actually, a very interesting question I have is why wasn't COVID foreseen? And I think there I have a theory that has to do with the SARS having been epidemic at the beginning of the century. Only 8,000 people got sick, and when this appeared, people sort of thought it was like SARS. But all of those surprises. So I think there's a huge focus on technology. And I think that 30 years from now, there will probably be major changes in technology. Maybe we have a glimmer of it now with the impact of Zoom replacing getting in your car or getting on an airplane. So, I think the technology surprises are partly surprises. Hydrogen may be a much bigger part of our energy supply. You'll remember 15 years or so ago, the hydrogen highway in California ended up not going anywhere. Well, hydrogen's back, and maybe that will be significant. So I would say keep your seatbelts on for surprise. But I think two things that will be constant. One is climate will be a central consideration. And I hate to say it, but so will the clash of nations. And we've got to manage both of those with wisdom.
Daniel Yergin, his new book is The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations. Daniel, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
It's great to be back with you. Thank you very much, and all the best.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.